This is the audiobook sample for Nothing's Ever Promised by T.C. Morgan. This is my 47th audiobook, and it was released on December 14th, 2021. Nothing's Ever Promised is a continuation of my previous audiobook, A Promise Kept. Similar themes carry over from the last novel, like distrust, family ties, and dealing with insecurity. The romance in this title is chock full of delightful, sarcastic humor, and doesn't really flourish until the very end due to its taboo nature, as the female lead believes herself to be the male lead's niece. Though I felt like A Promise Kept was well-paced and had suitable twists and turns, I did feel like this title dawdled and had a very lengthy middle. I was initially excited by the prospect of investigating the corrupt police force, but that doesn't really go anywhere, and we don't meet many interesting side characters to flesh that side of the story out. I also thought it was a bit odd how long the title stretches out the taboo nature of the main character's relationship, given how quickly Levi pieces together that Pearl could not be his brother's daughter because of how old she is. He even vocalizes this to Pearl very early in the book, but she just sort of brushes it aside and doesn't actually address it, even though it's a pretty huge hole in her perceived narrative. In this same vein, there's also a lot of will he, won't he moments that I honestly think would have had more distinction if this was a purely erotic novel, because their implementation in a romance, where the reader desires more character development, contributed to the meandering pacing. Still, I think this book has some very interesting and exciting ideas in it, and there are many memorable moments. It was also fun to see where the characters from the first book ended up, and how they were doing. I hope you enjoy this audiobook sample. Levi Hiroshi sat in his favorite easy chair, alternating between smoking a cigarette, drinking his dark coffee, and reading a news article of his that had just been published. After flicking ash from its tip into the heavy glass tray on the armrest beside him, he took another drag before putting the cigarette out. Then he took a deep breath and rubbed his forehead. Another day, another article on an issue he cared nothing about. President Nixon wanted more people in space. Levi thought there was enough happening on Earth without the president wasting additional taxpayer money on sending useless things orbiting the planet. Of course, his twin brother, Lawrence, argued him down about it. Levi lit another cigarette as he thought back to the argument they'd had. His brother had cursed him out and called him an unpatriotic idiot with no real vision of the future. They were seeing eye to eye less over the past few years, and it all stemmed from what Lawrence had perceived as Levi's lack of patriotism. But that wasn't at all true. Levi loved his country and his fellow Americans, and that was precisely why he felt compelled to be as raw as possible when writing his news articles. The truth was the most important thing to him, and every American deserved to know it. Lawrence always said that Levi could have found a better way to write that didn't, as he put it, sound so inflammatory. He blew a puff of smoke as he continued to read and think. Levi never saw the things he wrote as inflammatory. But sometimes the truth could be hard to accept, and a lack of acceptance could always be counted on to cause a reaction that some would consider riling. He smiled at that thought as he placed the newspaper down on the rolling table his typewriter sat upon. Then, Levi picked up one of the many small notepads that littered his side table. He flipped it open and thumbed through the pages, going over his notes on what he considered the most important story of his time to date. Shirley Chisholm, the first African-American councilwoman in the history of the country, was running for president. Now that was news. President Kennedy was dead, and so was his brother. In Levi's opinion, all of the progress the country had made died with them. But maybe, just maybe, the councilwoman would be the light at the end of the tunnel. Levi exhaled a puff of smoke out of his nostrils, right before he heard a soft rapping on his door. He had been living on his own in New York for several years, and hadn't met any acquaintances that he trusted enough to give his home address to. Glancing quickly at the calendar on the door, he checked the date, February 10th. His rent was due on the 15th of every month, and his landlady never came to collect early. The person on the other side of the door knocked again. "Just a minute," Levi called out as he opened the side desk drawer and pulled out the revolver that his oldest brother, Louis, had given him. One of the most controversial subjects he wrote heavily about was the civil rights movement, and he knew that had caused him to make some very dangerous enemies. All of his articles were under an assumed name, but that didn't stop the random death threats from popping up at some of the newspapers he wrote for. Levi checked the chambers of the gun before standing up and walking over to the door. Looking through the permanently smudged glass peephole, he could make out the figure of a woman. She appeared to be young, black, and not particularly well dressed for the cold New York winter weather. He stuffed the gun into the back of his pants as he undid the deadbolt. The chain lock rattled when he opened the door to the short woman on his threshold. "How can I help you?" The young woman looked up at him suspiciously before she answered. "Is this the home of Levi Hirsch?" "Who wants to know?" "Someone who desperately needs his help." Levi looked her up and down. He knew from experience that her thin jacket wasn't keeping any of her warmth in, let alone keeping the cold air out. She wore a Dodgers baseball cap that didn't cover her ears, which were turning pink with exposure. The bell-bottom pants that hugged her wide but shapely hips were wet from hem to calf, with snow that had been kicked up as she walked. Levi would have been surprised if there were still feet within her cloth sneakers, instead of necrotic stumps in need of amputation due to frostbite. Pushing the door a little to undo the chain lock, he spread it open in invitation. A link to purchase Nothing's Ever Promised is in the description. This title was a royalty share production, so I make 20% from any purchases. Thanks for listening.